The 11 most savage Dogman stories. 2 hours of terror, and it all begins right now. Dogman, the most savage animal I ever encountered. Dear Scary Stories NYC. As an outdoorsman, I get asked what kinds of animals to watch out for in the wild. I generally warn most of smaller creatures with venom, but I know people want to hear about the big bruiser animals like the bears. Those that believe in them also want to hear about Bigfoot or the Dogman, so I often find myself warning folks to stay away from bears that are feeding. Don't get between them and their food. For most of my life, I would say the most vicious thing I ever saw was a bear going after another animal it thought was trying to eat its food. But that all changed about 3 years ago, when I saw the only animal more heinous than a bear, or a human, that I've ever seen. And that would be the North American upright walking canid, colloquially known as the Dogman. This story happened up in Denali National Park in Alaska, and the bear I was observing was a grizzly. It was feeding at a sufficient distance from my location that I felt safe, but I wanted to monitor him in case that situation changed. I had my snowmobile at the ready to bust out of there at a moment's notice if need be. Everything seemed mellow, and I was feeling zen, maintaining both calm and yet alertness. I saw the Dogman before the bear did, as it ran up from behind. But before that Dogman was halfway from the tree line to the bear, the grizzly had turned and stood up to its full height. Normally, that would have been enough to repel any attacker, but when that Dogman saw the bear daring to challenge him, it only made him stand taller and swing his taloned claws even more frighteningly. The creature I am calling a Dogman had more of a wolf head than dog, but overall gave the impression of being a dog or canine type creature. When it first emerged from the woods behind the bear, it trotted on all fours, but it soon rose to its hind legs and sort of tiptoed up behind. I suppose 2 legs make less sound than 4, and the Dogman wanted to surprise that grizzly. It really did look very much like the Dogman you have in your thumbnails. That bluish-gray one. It had pointed ears like that. Its legs and arms looked similar as well. The one main difference, I would say, is that the one I saw had a thicker and more consistent coat of fur all over, and in that sense looked more dog-like. It was definitely the most frightening thing I'd ever witnessed. That Dogman looked scarier than something you might see in your worst nightmare. So, the bear was facing the Dogman, his paws and long claws held up threateningly. The Dogman was running now on his hind legs toward the bear. I would say the bear may have had a slight height advantage, but he was standing rigidly up straight, while the Dogman was bent forward a bit and running at his top speed through the snow. Somewhere in the middle of that, the bear did the mental calculations, and for perhaps the first time in bear history, he backed off. No, he ran away from a food source, willingly giving it over to the Dogman, rather than having to fight the savage and enraged canine. For his part, the Dogman did not slow down. Rather than barreling into the bear to knock him away, he dove into the food face first, looking like some sort of land shark. That doggy was hungry. I watched in amazement as the grizzly loped away, every so often looking back at the Dogman with sad eyes. When I looked back at that Dogman, he was already halfway through his meal, and a chill went through me from head to toe. I jumped in that snowmobile and I beat it out of there. A ranger stopped me later that morning, saying I wasn't allowed to use the snowmobile where I was. I took the opportunity to ask him about the local wildlife. I asked him if he'd ever seen anything steal food away from a fully grown grizzly bear before. He gave me wide eyes. I could tell by the way he didn't answer that he knew exactly what I was talking about. For some reason, he waved me on, allowing me to continue driving the snowmobile and not even giving me a ticket. I suppose that we Dogman witnesses have to stick together because Dogman is the most savage animal I have ever encountered. This episode and all our episodes are dedicated to Kathy Barrickman, who has been one of the nicest and most important people in the world for our channel. We wouldn't have made it as far as we did without her constant encouragement and support. We hope that you include her in your prayers now and forever. Kathy has always gotten all our perks, such as getting to see the weekly, secret, uncensored Dogman stories, the 21 hours of archived episodes, and of course all the advanced previews. You can get all these perks too by either joining our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com or by clicking that join link under this or any of our videos. Henry Lee Dogman will be along at the very end of the program with more details, but before that, we've got 2 solid, uninterrupted hours of Dogman stories for you. Starting right now. Dogman. In our campsite. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story for you of the most terrifying night of my life. I was trapped in my tent while a feral dogman circled me. Nothing is more scary than having a dogman in our campsite. So, my girlfriend from back then and I went camping way back in the mid-1990s. Either we didn't have cell phones or they didn't have cameras in them yet or something, because no, we didn't get any photos of what happened. All I can give you is my story, and here it is. Let's call my ex-girlfriend Bertha just as an in-joke. So, Bertha got up in the middle of the night, and when she did so, she woke me up by accident. We were sharing a tent. She told me she was going to go take a whiz, and I asked her if I should come stand guard. She thought the idea was stupid, that she was just going to do her business in the woods and go back to sleep. What could happen? I was tired enough that she sort of made sense to me, and I laid my head back down to rest. I couldn't go back to sleep, though, as I was waiting for Bertha to come back, which didn't happen, and then didn't happen, and finally continued to not happen. I got out of my sleeping bag cursing under my breath. I was really annoyed that this girl was making me do all this and put on my boots. Then I angrily unzipped the tent and stuck my head out to start to climb outside. I heard it before I saw it. There was a snarling kind of a sound, an angry canine sound. I looked up and I saw it. As expected, it was a dog, but it was a big one, and it was black. It had long, pointed ears, I guess like a Doberman, but it was dark all over. As I watched, it rose from a sitting position, looking the way a dog would look when sitting, to a standing position, looking the way a man would look while standing, on its hind legs. My first impression was, this is the great god Anubis. I watched as its eyes glowed, and it stood taller than any man stands any place on this planet. Then, the great god Anubis fell to all fours and raced toward my tent, saliva flying in the wind as it barked loudly and bared its teeth in a display of ferocity I will continue to remember even if I am reincarnated 27 times. Needless to say, I pulled my head back in that tent and zipped up. I could hear the huge dog sniffing and smelling the tent, circling it, and then circling it again. Bertha. Had this thing gotten Bertha? Or was she hiding from it, afraid to come back in the tent with the monster so near? I was praying for her to be okay, but really, not as much as I was praying for me to be okay, if you know what I mean. The sound of a large dogman smelling your tent is not a very pleasant one, and I was getting so nervous that I started to feel queasy. That was not a good development. I needed to hold things together. I focused on breathing in through my nose and out through my mouth, and it kept my mind off the walking mountain of doom circling me over and over. It took me a while to notice when the dogman had stopped sniffing around. Sometime in the middle of my meditation, it seemed to have walked off. I listened for what felt like a long time, and I didn't hear anything moving at all. Bracing myself, I thought this might be a good time for me to take a second look outside that tent. Boy, was that a mistake. The dogman was literally sitting there outside my zipper hole, waiting for me to do exactly what I was doing. Panicking, I pulled back in the tent, but this time I was zipping up while screaming and trying to keep the animal out and myself in. Even after the zipper was up, I kept screaming like a woman at that monster. I was telling it to go away. I was saying all sorts of angry things at it, as though it could understand English. In short, I was pathetic. I finally found my true calling, and that is to be prey for a large land predator. I was disgusted with myself and worried about Bertha, but mainly, I was trying not to be ill inside that tent. My head hurt as I woke up and someone was screaming at me. I had been so unconscious that I wasn't even remembering who I was at first, and it took me some time to realize that I recognized that voice shouting at me. It was Bertha. Bertha! I got up and unzipped the tent. It was starting to get light out. The morning had arrived. I wondered when I had fallen asleep and looked around to see if I had been sick. It seems I hadn't been. Poor Bertha had spent the night hiding in the woods, watching the dogman circle our tent. It turns out she saw it before it saw or smelled her, and she was able to stay upwind of it or downwind, or whichever of those two is the preferable one. It turns out I was lucky she was the one out there and not me, because I wouldn't have known to hide my scent the way she knew. Once Bertha figured out I wasn't hurt, she laid into me on what a coward I was, forcing her to sleep outside in the cold, like I was supposed to somehow save her from the great god Anubis. How would I do that exactly? Should I have used my enchanted green lantern ring? Or maybe I should have shouted Shazam? Bertha told me she wanted to date a bigger and more protective man than me, and we soon went back to being just friends. Later, she married this pipsqueak half her size, and she bossed him around until he expired from the exertion. So much for bigger and more protective. I'm just glad that old Bertha and I managed to survive. Dogman. In our campsite. The spring-heeled Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, my father was a police officer in Wisconsin for 17 years, but after he retired, he almost never talked about his police days. About a year before he passed, he told me a story one night that really knocked my socks off. I had been talking about Spring-Heeled Jack, and he got very interested. He was unaware of the stories of how, in England, there were reports of a strange man, back in the 1800s, who would frighten ladies by either lighting something up on his chest or firing flames from his chest, depending on your interpretation. I told Dad that he got the nickname Spring-Heeled Jack because he was seen leaping tall fences and leaping to rooftops to make his getaway. It doesn't seem he was ever accused of doing anything worse than mischief. It wasn't like he hurt anybody as far as what I had read. There are paranormal and UFO researchers who speculate about the idea that possibly Spring-Heeled Jack might have been an alien or an ultra-terrestrial. Maybe he came from the flying saucers or from the future. At the time, people thought he must be a very rich man to be able to have the high-tech devices he seemed to carry and to be able to afford high-tech springs in the heels of his shoes that would carry him to safety. If he were a good guy, why did he have to disguise himself to look so frightening? Why, to frighten the real bad guys, came the answer. Soon, fictional stories about Spring-Heeled Jack, the rich man hero who disguised himself to look frightening and had high-tech devices which made him appear paranormal, were selling like hotcakes in the penny dreadful magazines of the era. Soon, Spring-Heeled Jack appeared as the hero of plays. All of this was just entering the public domain as Bruce Wayne and Batman were created from the ashes of Spring-Heeled Jack's legacy. My father wasn't impressed with those theories, though. He told me there was no way that was a normal man. He spoke with conviction, as though he had been there. I asked him if he'd time traveled to Old England, and if not, how could he be so sure? Dad withdrew at first, as if reconsidering continuing the conversation, but eventually, he relented and told me he was going to tell me a story, but I had to promise never to repeat it to my mother. That made me laugh, and I agreed. According to my father, he and his partner got called to a disturbance at a late-night store. When they got there, they saw a man with a blinking light on his chest running out of the place. Dad said it looked like that light on Iron Man's chest in the comic books. Dad and his partner got out of their cop car and squatted down behind the doors on either side, unaware if the guy was armed. They got him in their sights and ordered him to lie down on the sidewalk. They gave him one more warning and said that if he didn't comply, they were going to have to fire. I asked him what the guy looked like, and Dad said he seemed to have a dog-shaped head. I laughed, but my father shot me a hard glance, and I realized he was being for real. I asked him to elaborate on what that meant that a man with a light on his chest had a dog's head. My father said his attention was mainly on trying to suss out if that thing on the guy's chest was a weapon or if he was armed in any other sense. Other than that, with the bright light shining in their faces, he and his partner mainly could make out that its silhouette seemed to have the outline of a dog-headed man, or a very large dog standing upright on its hind legs. Well, according to Dad, that dog guy bent his dog knees just a little, and he thought he was about to get down on the sidewalk as he had been asked to do. But instead, that dogman flew straight up in the air and backward, landing somehow on the roof of the store behind him and running away. I wasn't clear if he flipped in the air or just went up and backward, but I got the impression that the guy landed on his feet up on the roof behind him. However he landed, he hit that roof running away toward the back of the building. Dad and his partner got back in the police car and drove around the side toward the back, where they saw that guy leap off the roof of the back of the store and just keep running. Dad said his partner said ouch when the guy touched ground, expecting him to crumple, but nothing of the sort happened. He landed on his hind legs and kept running that way, bipedally, moving at least as fast as their patrol vehicle was going. The figure came up on a tall, chain-link fence that Dad said had to have been at least 20 feet high, and Dad said he, quote, rose over it, then landed and kept on running. I asked what that meant, rose over it. Did he mean the guy jumped over the fence? Dad said that when you jump over something, it has a certain look to it. You can tell that the propulsion is coming from your legs, or your pole that you're vaulting with, or whatever. It looks like it makes sense, according to the laws of physics. When this guy went over that fence, Dad said it looked as though he were being lifted and swung over by a rope attached to his back. He said the guy's thick dog legs even swung back and forth in the air as he flew over the obstacle, the way they might if he was being pulled up from behind by a string. Before I could even ask if there might have been a helicopter overhead and if he might have been seeing a movie shoot, Dad assured me that he neither saw nor heard any helicopter flying overhead. It had to be some technology at work, he told me. He was certain about this. But whatever kind of tech that was had to be more advanced than anything we're officially allowed to know about. This, my father told me, threw him into a quandary. If the guy they saw was an actual alien or an enemy agent, then he would be derelict in his duty if he did not report the incident and put it on the official record. If, on the other hand, the tech belonged to our side or high-powered interests in the USA, then reporting it might be considered treason. And in either case, he'd be placing not only his own life in danger, but the lives of his entire family as well. So, he and his partner decided to report as little as they could. They reported the testimony of the store owner, then claimed that when they pursued, they saw nothing, and the man had somehow gotten away. They downplayed it and moved on as quickly as they could, not wanting to make any waves. Both my parents are gone now, so hopefully Dad is okay with me telling his old story to you. I'm keeping it anonymous anyway, just in case it might actually get me in some sort of trouble, even this many years later. I never saw my father look so spooked as he did when he told me this story, and it was not fun to see those expressions on his face. He had always seemed undefeated to me, but on that day, I saw genuine fear in his eyes, because that was the day when he confessed to me about the spring-heeled Dogman. 6 generations of werewolves. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am the 6th son of the 6th generation of a family cursed with lycanthropy. I am the last to suffer this disease, and if I have children, they will be 7th generation and therefore free from this affliction. My great-great-great-grandfather Silas got himself stupidly involved in conflict over reports of werewolf sightings. This was in some town in Arizona, supposedly. Some small town that probably hasn't existed in 70 years, as far as I know. People were claiming to see werewolves back then, and so this old woman living on the edge of town was blamed for it, just like an old-fashioned witch hunt. The legend is that her dying wish was to put a curse on my family, turning the 6th son of each generation into werewolves ourselves for 6 generations. I have no idea how much of that origin story is true, but I know the lycanthropy part is real, as its mastery over my life and the decisions I am able to make is unshakable. Now, I inherited nothing from my father except his lycanthropy, but my great-grandfather has left us a house built specially for our family problem. Great-grandpa Clem was the first truly successful person in our family line, and it was his intention to make certain that his descendants would have an easier go of it for the last 2 generations of the curse. He built us a large house with a basement and a sub-basement. In that sub-basement is what we call the werewolf cells, because that's exactly what they are. These are cells built out of 12-foot thick concrete walls, with one steel-reinforced security door for each, and chains that haven't been broken once in these 3 generations. There is a shelf built into the wall in each to place food on, and metal drains located where the floor subtly slants downward. There are ventilation shafts hidden in the ceiling. It's easy to hose it down in the morning after to keep it clean. Really, I have to hand it to Great-Grandpa Clem. It's very simply, yet very intelligently designed. For 3 nights every month, during the full moon, I bring some raw meat and a big bowl of water down to the cell, and I lock myself in. Then, I chain myself up and try to fall asleep before the change happens. I find transforming to be extremely uncomfortable and unsettling, although I wouldn't exactly call it painful. I have been able to sleep through it, but it doesn't always work. A big part of the transformation for me personally is the complete loss of consciousness on my part. I have no memories about what it's like to be the lycanthrope, but I can see the evidence of the change after I wake up. I think that's why I'm sometimes able to sleep through it. I'm sure whoever I am becoming has some sort of consciousness at that point, while I myself am either dreaming or else entirely unconscious. These are guesses on my part, as I really have no perceptions or memories from being in that other state. There are 2 other cells besides mine. The sub-basement is large enough to accommodate 3 generations of werewolves at once. Now, before my great-great-grandfather Clem hit it rich in the early 1930s, when everybody else was going poor, the first 2 generations of werewolves in my family had a rough going of it. Silas and then his son Samuel spent the late 1800s through the early 1900s moving around from town to town and state to state, trying to escape their reputation as a werewolf clan. But even when they managed to fit in, things would start to go wrong when the full moon came around. They tried tying the afflicted ones down, but they could break free of any bond. Anytime things started to look up for the family, one of the werewolves would break free during the full moon and go on a rampage. While in the werewolf or lycanthropic state, the victim loses all sense of morality or social conditioning. He or she can sometimes just do whatever it wants, no matter how foul or unforgivable the deed might be. Then, they follow their homing instinct back to the place they live in while in their human form, leaving all sorts of evidence along the way home of their guilt. The fact that my family was able to survive that dark period is almost a miracle in itself. After my great-grandfather Clem was told as a child that he would become a werewolf upon reaching manhood, he went out and found himself employment. He worked factory jobs it would no longer be legal for a kid to work, and he saved up enough to buy himself chains strong enough to hold a bull elephant, and enough concrete to cement one end of each of those chains into a 3-foot thick floor in their basement. After that, he was able to lock his father in before the transformations each month, and once it came time for him to change as well, he could join his father in that basement. I guess surviving years in that manner gave Clem the ideas he needed to put in the more deluxe cells we use now. I say deluxe, but it's really just a whole lot of concrete and steel. We've left the ventilation system as it was in the early 20th century. These were built to last, at least to last through the end of my life. Lycanthropy, like some other afflictions, can have its effects largely mitigated if you possess the wealth to do so. I call our sub-basement the Bat Cave, only instead of helping me to be a hero, this Bat Cave prevents me from being a villain. I dated a young woman a few years back when I was 20. She and I started getting serious and she wanted to get closer. I told her about the werewolf thing, expecting it to be the end of all of it. I thought she would be turned off by the idea, either because she believed me and was terrified, or because she didn't believe me and thought I had bats in my belfry. Instead, something kind of the opposite happened. She liked me more after seeing the basement cells and figuring out that I was not joking or exaggerating in any way about any part of this. She wanted to see me transform. She wanted me to go public about the whole thing. She wanted me to transform in public. She had this weird notion that I was the last of my kind, and I owed it to society and medical science to educate the public about lycanthropy. My attitude was more like I was the last in my line who would need to bear the shame of this curse. Better to keep it a secret so that if I have children, none of them will have the specter of the curse hanging over them. None of them would ever even have to think about any of this. If I do have kids, maybe I'll even keep it a secret from them. Why would they even need to know, really? But this girl, she was all about werewolf rights and how I should reclaim my destiny and all this stuff. She'd give me these inspiring speeches about how I should run with the wolves, because that's what I was, and that she wanted to run along with me. Of course, if we did that, she would have lasted about 30 seconds before ending up as Dogman doggy food, but she didn't seem to grasp that part of it at all. To her, this was a very romantic thing. For a while, I thought about figuring out a way to let her watch the transformation. If she saw the difference between her fantasy version of it and the ugly reality of it, that she would understand. But there was no way to let her see without placing her in harm's way. I tried taping a small camera to the wall and leaving it on record, but by the next morning, it had been smashed to bits. The Dogman is shy and doesn't like to be photographed, I suppose. And so that's my story, at least so far. I'm sorry if it wasn't as exciting as some werewolf stories, but I'm not really sorry. I hope to keep it as boring as I can, to be completely honest. I think you would too, if you were in my situation. I wonder, if I live another 100 years, will this house remain strong enough to hold me inside it? If not, I better become wealthy enough to restore it in time, because I am the final member of 6 generations of werewolves. Dogman haunted my family. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was a kid, I had truly nightmarish encounters with Dogman, but we didn't have the word Dogman back then, at least not in my town or in my family. We called it a lot of things, such as a hairy demon, but it was just like what people talk about in some of the Dogman stories that you read these days. It shook up my entire family and really caused us to live in fear for a while there. Let me go back to the beginning and explain it as it happened, in the order it happened in. One night, I was in bed around 10 or 11, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking I was hearing someone outside the window, and one time, I saw a shadow too. Too chicken to get out of bed and look, I just lay there in bed, with the covers pulled up over my head, and tried to find explanations for what I was hearing. Explanations that would make me feel safe instead of scared. Then, I heard it, outside the window. Someone was standing there now. I could hear them breathing and shuffling in the muddy dirt. I pulled my head out from under the covers, and I could see a vague shadow behind the window. Or was I imagining that? Someone spoke my name outside, and I dove back down under my covers. It sounded like my grandmother, my paternal grandmother. She was the one who had passed on last month. I loved Grandma and I missed her, but this wasn't the way I wanted to be reunited. I heard my name again, in her voice, and it sounded so pleasant. Back came all my memories of my grandmother, and I had to at least go look-see. I got out of bed and stood up, regaining my balance both literally and emotionally, before taking the first step toward that window. Was this going to be my grandma's ghost outside? I wondered. I took a second step toward it. Would she appear as an angel? If she were an angel, she could have just appeared here inside my room. I took a third step toward the window. Why would she be outside? Unless she rose from her grave and walked all the way here from the cemetery? Unsure if I was doing the right thing, I took a tentative fourth step toward that window. I was close enough now to reach out and grab that curtain in my hand. Even so, it took me some time to build up the courage. I wanted to do this, but I also really wanted to go run back into bed. A laughing voice came from outside, saying my name again. She laughed like I was being silly, so I figured I probably was. Grabbing the curtain and pulling it back from the window, I looked out and saw 2 glowing, orange-red eyes, shaped as though they were furious at me. All I saw at first was those eyes. Then I witnessed a mouth opening beneath those eyes. This was not a normal mouth. It was feral, canine. The bright white teeth it revealed seemed too long to fit in that nasty-looking snout. This was some kind of dog, but it was taller than I was, and I was already 5'8" or 9 probably by that point. I was going to turn 15 in 2 months, I think, when this all went down. I would guess that whoever or whatever I was looking at was over 6 feet tall, but whoever it was wasn't impossibly tall. It might have been a guy in a costume, but I really don't think so. It seemed alive, but not in the normal sense. Its hair blew all around as though there were a windstorm going outside. And there was no windstorm going on outside. Maybe you'll understand what I mean if you visualize it walking through a field of electricity. Like all its hair was standing on end, all over, and blowing around. It just didn't look like a guy in a suit or an unidentified animal. It looked like it had walked up from hell. I screamed and ran upstairs to my parents' room. I felt embarrassed doing that at my age, but I was completely freaked out about what had just happened. I couldn't connect the voice of my grandmother with what I saw out there, and the confusion made me even more frightened than witnessing what I had seen. My father woke up and believed my story, pulling on his bathrobe and running downstairs and out the front door. He looked around, but didn't see anyone there. He came back in pretty angry and told me that it must be one or more of the kids in the neighborhood trying to be funny. He was deeply offended that they chose to impersonate his late mother, and so he took this all very personally. My father quizzed me about the height of the so-called demon monster. Then we went down a list of who was around that height, who would remember what my grandma sounded like. It was a short list, and there were 3 kids, a little older than I was, who my father was certain were behind this. He thought it might be one of them, or it might be all 3 of them, but he couldn't figure out who else it could be. I asked him not to accuse them unless he found proof, because I didn't want to do anything to start a fight with those three. The real reason I didn't want my father accusing anyone was that I was pretty certain that what I saw was not human. I didn't know what it was that I saw, but it couldn't have been a man in a suit as far as I was concerned. So let's skip ahead to the next night. I went to bed around 10 or 10:30, but once again, I couldn't sleep because I was hearing someone outside that window again. I thought about going to get my father, but I really just wanted it to go away, and I wanted to sleep. Then, I heard my name being spoken outside the window, and it felt like a bolt of lightning had shot through me. It wasn't my grandmother's voice this time, though. It was my father's voice, and he sounded angry. I was frozen, staring at the window from my bed. I didn't know whether to go run upstairs and see if my father was up there, or pull the covers over my head and pray for it to leave me alone. A hard rapping at my window bolted me upright. Was it gonna break in? My father's voice stated my name again, louder this time, and angrier. He was ordering me to go to the window. Realizing it was inevitable, I got up and marched toward that window to pull the curtain back. I braced myself for what I might see, and in my mind, I rehearsed the path that I would run upstairs to get my real father. I took one final deep breath, then grabbed the curtain and pulled it back. What I saw on the other side of that glass was not what I was expecting to see at all. It was actually my dad, and he looked really, really mad. I asked him what was up, and he asked me if I had made large dog tracks. I didn't understand what he was talking about, and that annoyed him further. Apparently, there were dog tracks in the mud outside my window, and they were too large to be real. Did I think I was being funny? He could tell by my utter confusion that I really didn't know what he was talking about, and I didn't make fake dog prints outside my window to bother him. You could tell my father was confused. He didn't have a simple explanation for what was going on anymore. If neighborhood kids wanted to scare me, would they really go the full route to get or make shoes that left giant dog prints behind? That would imply they had access to brains and a budget, and the three main suspects in my father's mind had neither. I asked Dad if he could please knock on my door and not my window, as it scared the hell out of me when he did that, and he actually apologized. I think that was the first time my dad ever apologized to me, and maybe the last time too. He didn't do that too often. Okay, my details might be a little messy on the next part, but it was either 1 or 2 nights later, or later that same week at least, that I next had a nighttime visitation outside my window. This time, as I was about to fall asleep, I heard the voice speaking to me. I hadn't heard anyone milling about first this time, so it was different from the other times. This time, the voice was a girl I knew from school, and she sounded like she was crying. She said my name in a very sad way, and then she said it again. I really have to say, I didn't know what to expect this time, but by that point, I was sort of resigned to all this. It was just something I had to get up and do. It was not in any way less frightening than the previous times. In fact, it was a lot more frightening. I felt as though my skin were electrified. I had goosebumps, and I felt as though I were walking through that same field of electricity that caused all my hair to levitate off my body in all directions like the Dogman I had seen that first night. Once again, I braced myself, and once again, I grabbed that curtain. Once again, I pulled the cloth back, and once again I peered outside. Only this time, I saw that my window and my window screen were wide open. I didn't remember opening either of them, and this time, before I even consciously noticed the eyes glowing in the darkness, a large clawed hand reached in, aiming its human-like fingers with taloned ends directly toward my throat. I swear I somersaulted backward, but it wasn't as graceful in real life as that sounds in the description. It just happened out of pure instinct. I reared backward away from that claw so fast that I lost balance and fell backward, and my momentum carried me the rest of the wobbly way. I wouldn't have won any medals with it, but at least I managed not to hurt myself, and I made it out of my bedroom door with that monster still outside. This time, my father grabbed his Louisville Slugger before heading downstairs. We didn't know if the Dogman was going to be inside the house or out, and he searched all of downstairs before looking around outside. He said the exterior of my window had been clawed up, and the thing had somehow opened my window from the outside. My father went and got his tools and started hammering the window shut until our neighbor shouted at him to quit it. I didn't want to sleep downstairs that night, and I asked if I could use the guest bedroom upstairs. Well, I pretty much moved into that guest bedroom, and I helped Dad seal up all the downstairs windows all the way around the next morning. He had central heating and air conditioning installed, and it became like living in a department store downstairs. We considered moving, but then the Dogman seemed to move on instead. None of us ever had anything like that happen to any of us again after that. So, I guess you might say that we never found out for sure what exactly happened the time that Dogman haunted my family. Dogman in the crawl space under the floor. Dear Scary Stories NYC. My family and me live in the city now, but we used to have this run-down old house outside of town, and we had a really bad experience that you will not believe involving this Dogman. I'm just going to tell you the story straight out. Our house was really a shack with multiple rooms inside it. The thing had a tin roof, and it was always hot inside, except in the winter when it was freezing. There was that old song called Love Shack. Well, my sister and I used to call our house the Hate Shack. It was not only uncomfortable, it was far from anything, and it was rotting away all around us while we lived there. Our mother was not the overprotective type, and she pretty much let us run around and do what we wanted, even though that was a rough neighborhood. Even out into the woods, there were bad people doing bad things. There was just a mean vibe over the whole area. The one rule my mother had, for some reason, is that we weren't allowed to go down by the lake in the woods. I have no idea why as far as that goes. Sometimes there were bad kids down there, but not any more than any other location around. My mom said we could never go to the lake though, and that made the lake very inviting for me. I went there often. One day, I was at the lake around dusk. I had been skipping stones, but by that point I was just hanging out by the water, relaxing, and watching the water move around hypnotically. The lake was surrounded by the woods, and when people weren't coming in there and arguing with each other, it could be very beautiful. On that evening, however, I was to be bothered by a non-human kind of interruption. The kind of interruption that comes when you fall asleep at dusk, but wake up in the dark with an immense dogman smelling you all over. That's what happened to me. That's the short version. I was sleeping, and I felt like I was being tickled by a dog sniffing me. I wasn't so deeply asleep that I'd forgotten who and where I was, and I knew I didn't have a dog. That meant that, at best, this was someone else's pet smelling me. It might also be a stray. It might be friendly, or it might be savage. It might be clean, or it might be carrying something. I resisted opening my eyes and tried to remain still, breathing as I had been before. That last part was the hardest, as my breathing was now raggedier than Andy. I shivered all over, so I imagined I was on a warm beach on a hot day. The dog kept sniffing until it came up to my face, when it licked me on the nose. The dog saliva went up my nostrils, and I had no choice but to pull back and open my eyes. I breathed through my mouth and focused on clearing my sinuses before I even got a look at the canine. When I looked over at it, I found I was looking at the massive arms of the largest dog I had ever seen. It was sitting up, but I couldn't see its head. I literally had to roll left onto my back and stare straight up to see the head of that dog. I saw this bizarrely tall monster stare back down at me with eyes that glowed brightly against the dark night sky. I was terrified, but I tried not to show it. I made a move to sit up, and the dog placed one paw on top of my head, as though to politely ask me to remain in place. I thought maybe it meant the dog was friendly, or maybe it just meant I'd better not move. In either case, it looked healthy, so hopefully that was good news. And so we sat there like that for a while, the incredibly tall, dark dog enjoying the evening with his paw on the head of an immobilized human at its feet. After he had rested enough for his taste, the dog placed his other paw on the ground and pushed himself up into the air. This was most unexpected, and I inhaled air in shock so hard that I almost choked lying there. The dog's head now seemed 14 feet off the ground from my perspective, and the paw that had been on my head was now in my line of vision for the first time. It was far more like a hand than like a paw. The dog's arms were far too thick and muscular to be those of a regular kind of dog. This thing was more like a werewolf than a dog, or a dog man, I guess would be the popular vernacular. It gazed around, way up over my head, appearing relaxed, then suddenly tensed into a perfectly still, motionless position, staring off at something it could see, but I could not. It remained frozen like a statue for some time. Then, without the slightest bit of warning, it tore off, leaping over my face and making me scream in fear. I sat up and watched as the werewolf man ran into the woods like a human would run. It was not only bipedal, but it pumped its arms as it ran like a man. It had a butt, not a tail. Its back legs were a bit funky and sort of like a deer or something, but it really was more like a man than a dog. You could see it more from behind than from the front, but this was not a normal dog, and this was not a guy in a dog costume either. My heart was beating like it was gonna blow up in my chest, and I ran back home crying. I tried to hide it from my mother, but she saw my wet cheeks and started making fun of me for not being a man. Well, I wasn't a man. I was still just a teenager. Needless to say, I never told my family about the dogman I had seen, but from then on, I obeyed my mother's rule about avoiding the lake. Soon, the summer was over, and the autumn took over. The weather got colder, school started again, and I forgot all about the Dogman by the lake. As the weather got colder, I started hearing sounds under the floor in my bedroom. I should explain the house and its layout better so you'll understand the situation. Our house was all on one floor, and it had a crawl space underneath it. There was no attic, and there was no basement. The crawl space was only accessible if you removed one of the wood panels covering it all around the base of the house, and then you would need to crawl in, as the bugs and spiders crawled all over you. So, that autumn, I kept hearing sounds coming from underneath my floorboards. Sometimes, some of the banging sounds would be pretty large, and I saw the floorboards themselves moving on several occasions as I heard the sounds down there. It really seemed as though something was alive. My first thought was to tell my ma, but I was afraid she would make me go under there and flush the animal out. If it was a raccoon or a possum, I could get rabies. I didn't know there was a government service to take care of wild animal problems, and I figured this was something that was going to cost my parents money, so I was afraid to say anything about it. I didn't have any money to pay for someone to clean out our crawl space, and I was too chicken to do it myself. One morning, when I was getting out my jacket for school while my mother was in the room talking to me, I was shocked by something I saw, and I let out a little surprised noise. I tried to downplay it, but my mother demanded to know what I had seen, and then she saw it too. Something had been eating away, or clawing away, at the floorboards in one corner of the bottom left of my closet. There was a hole there, large enough that you could stick your fist through it. My mother let loose a long list of words you can't say on your channel, and she said she was going to call to have someone clean out our crawl space. Oh, I was so relieved. I wasn't even in trouble. We both saw the hole at the same time. I wasn't going to have to risk my life under the floorboards, and I wasn't going to have to pay for the animal people for the rest of my life. I was practically dancing as I walked to school that day. I felt such a huge relief, like a weight had been lifted off my back. On the way to school, though, I felt that weird feeling like when you're being watched. I especially felt it when I passed one patch of woods. I kept telling myself I was just feeling paranoid, but it was an oppressive feeling, and it didn't go away until I was inside the school building itself. That night, as I got back, the animal control people were just leaving. I asked my mother what they found, and she grouchily told me they found nothing. She was annoyed that mostly all they did was make suggestions to her about shoring up the house to prevent further animals from getting in. I asked her what was wrong with those ideas. They sounded good to me. She got right up in my face and told me that the problem with those ideas was that they all cost money. And money was something we had very little of. That night, I heard whatever it was under my floor again. I grabbed my Andrew McCutcheon autographed bat and went straight to my closet to see if some animal was trying to chew its way into my room. I stood there about to open the door when a bit of cowardice ran through me and I hesitated. Did I really want to see what ugly thing was gonna be there when I opened that door? The answer was no. I really just wanted it to go away. So I tapped on the door with my bat and I said something like, "Mr. Animal, please go away, because I don't want to have to hurt you, and I don't want you hurting me." I heard no reaction at all, so this time I stomped on the floor in front of the closet to make my point. Only, on the second stomp, My foot went right through that rotting floor. I tried to pull it back up, but it felt like either something grabbed it or maybe it was stuck on something. It felt like something warm and furry. I panicked and screamed like a little girl, almost high enough to shatter glass. My mother ran into the room and started cursing a lot, which didn't help me get my foot free. I grabbed the door of the closet and tried to pull my foot up out of the hole in the floor, but I only succeeded in pulling the old door right out of the frame. I fell backwards on my butt onto that rotting old wooden floor. Then, the single most iconic moment of my childhood happened. The floorboards by my closet began cracking apart and splitting from side to side. Up, out of the floor, rose the massive figure of that same Dogman from the lake, the one I had seen on that day. He had followed me home. Was it because he liked me, or because he'd like me for dinner? I screamed like a crazy person, and at some point my mother must have run out because I didn't see her around anymore. The wall the closet was in must have been some kind of supporting wall or something, because the roof started coming down all around us, and a big gash opened up in my bedroom wall. The Dogman ran out of that, and I ran out of the front door about 3 seconds before it came down, and was no door any longer. My sister and mother had both gotten out before me, and of course, my father was off with one of his girlfriends, so the family was safe. I saw the Dogman running off into the woods. That thing was like a living special effect. It was bigger than big, and it ran faster than a man could run because it was so tall. That Dogman really was a thing to see. If it sounds like I admire it, I guess in a weird way I do. I mean, I'm scared of it, and I don't want to see it again because it's just too big and too feral. But of all the feral creatures living out in the wild, I think it's the most magnificent and unique. What it was doing under my house I don't know, but I think it was just trying to sleep near me, which dogs like to do. I'm not trying to make it sound like it's something friendly, because it was a wild animal. I just hope it has a long life, and I hope it stays free. That's all I'm saying. So the county relocated us into this low-income housing development. It's about 800 stories tall with about 57 four-bedroom apartments on each floor. Takes 90 minutes to get from the street to our apartment. Okay, I'm exaggerating. But it's a big and nasty building. There are roaches everywhere, and the elevators smell like ammonia. But at least the floors don't break under my feet if I stomp them. And if Dogman wants to visit, he's going to have to climb a lot of stairs and fight off the rats. At least while we're living here, I'm not going to have to worry about Dogman in the crawl space under my floor. My cat scared Dogman away. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I live in a town in New Jersey that I don't want to name. We are far closer to Philadelphia than to New York City, and it's been a great place to live for my entire life. Now, my wife and I are raising our own family here. One of the things that has changed during my lifetime is that bears, which never used to come near, now brazenly walk right into people's backyards. And, apparently, judging by what happened to my family, bears are not the only large predators walking through town. And I found this out because my cat scared Dogman away. We, as I mentioned earlier, have two very young children, a boy and a girl. We also have a female cat who was living with us before we had any kids. She's large and in charge, so for this story, let's call her Marge. Now, Marge once scared a dog off our property that was twice her size. It was some sort of beagle-looking mixed breed, and it thought it could mess with her, but she went into hissing mode and showed him her teeth. He wasn't a smart puppy, so he didn't take her message to heart. He made one more move in her direction, and she turned into some kind of feline three-dimensional lawnmower, with her super sharp cat claws flying in every direction unpredictably, her teeth snapping out in between, and she rose up on her hind legs during this to increase her size. That dog never took such a licking, and he ran off making sounds like a broken water pipe. Meanwhile, Marge was just sitting there, grooming herself like nothing had ever happened. She's not one to be messed with. So, the time she messed with Dogman went like this. It was nighttime, and Marge wanted to go out. I know I just told you we had bears, and I know we shouldn't have been letting her out, but at that point we still were. Now she's got a fenced-in porch she can sit outside in, but other than that, she's an indoor cat. However, back then we still tossed her outside to do her business, and this, in fact, is the story of why we stopped doing that. Marge was scratching to go out the back door, and my wife was talking on her phone. She let the cat out, then went and stood outside in the dark just to get a breath of fresh air while chatting with her sister or whoever it was at the time. Marge usually trotted down the stairs, went only a little way into the yard, did her business, then scratched dirt on top of it to hide it. Not that time. That time, she tore off down the stairs and across the back of the yard into the darkness where my wife couldn't see her. She said Marge was making an angry yowling sound she had never even heard before. So, my wife ran back in the house and turned on the overhead lights we have to light up the backyard if we're having a party or whatever. She screamed for me at this point. I couldn't understand what she was saying, but it sure sounded urgent, so I ran to the backyard. Both of us saw our cat screeching and arching its back, hissing at this dark silhouette standing just beyond our back fence. And here's the thing about the figure out there. It was not a bear. It was a kind of bipedal dog. It was like a prehistoric man all covered in fur, and its back legs were bent and animal-like, not ape or human-shaped, and its head was like a dog. Maybe it even was just an incredibly large dog that was leaning against our chain-link back fence. I don't know, because I only saw it standing there. My wife told me it was too wide at the waist to be a dog. It seemed to be a cross between a human or primate with a dog. We have both seen bears with mange, and this was not that. We both are aware that those can seem very much like Dogman, but this was a dog-headed creature. It had dog ears on top, not bear ears, and we both can tell the difference at a glance. My wife told me it was my job to rescue Marge from that thing, so I ran inside to find something I could use to defend myself against it. I found nothing, and then I ran back outside in time for my wife to say that it had walked away. I couldn't see the Dogman anywhere, but I saw large Marge once again sitting there grooming as though nothing had happened. According to my wife, the large creature walked away like a man. It didn't drop to all fours before retreating. It simply realized it had met its match in Marge, then turned around and walked away on its hind legs as though that were normal. My wife was flabbergasted, and she just kept repeating this information to me over and over again, as though I didn't understand what she said to me the first time. So, like I said, that is why we screened in our back porch, and that is why we don't let Marge out any longer. Because of the night that my cat scared Dogman away. Dogman almost drove me crazy. I was a weird kid. I used to carry a shovel with me when our family would go to outdoor events. I would find places to dig where the adults might not notice, and I would find things. I found 2 stone arrowheads. I found fossils. I found an antique bottle of Coca-Cola. I was as happy finding an imprint of an ancient insect on a bit of shale as I was finding the bottle cap of an extinct brand of 20th century soda pop. In each case, holding that object in my hand brought back the power and reality of that time. It made all time feel like the present moment. It also allowed me to get away from my parents and my sister, who were nothing like me. They were a tribe, while I was an individual. They looked like each other, they spoke like each other, they listened to the same radio shows, and they were very enthusiastic about the same things. I, on the other hand, was unfortunately born with at least half a brain. This caused them to despise me, and they were suspicious of everything I said. What is that supposed to mean is all I heard day and night. They assumed every comment I made was an insult that had sailed right over their limited intelligence. They were wrong. Only about a third of what I said was insulting to them. But that's because I'm very restrained, and have been since an early age. That's kind of why nobody believed it when Dogman almost drove me crazy. So we were on a day trip to Bear Mountain upstate. I took the chance to break away from my family and start digging my little holes. It was a plastic shovel that I carried with me, but it did the job as long as the soil wasn't too hard. I managed to keep most of this a secret from my entire family. They thought I was weird enough as it was. I didn't need to provide them with evidence. I didn't have a metal detector and I didn't know about dowsing. I just dug where I felt like digging. I would usually dig between 5 and 15 holes on each day trip, depending on how much time I was able to stay out of the eyesight of the family. And I would get 1 to 3 or 4 items that I felt were keepers that I would attempt to smuggle home with me. The smaller items could just get stuck in my pocket, but the larger items like the vintage Coke bottle required a bit of sneakiness to smuggle home. So I was digging away contentedly in the park under the shade of some big old trees when I heard someone walking in the distance. I stopped and looked, because if it was my family, I would want to hide what I was doing. Same if it were a park ranger. I kept looking in that direction but couldn't see anything moving. I listened as intently as I could, but only heard the leaves blowing in the wind and some chirping crickets. I thought maybe it was a small animal or a branch falling randomly. Then bam! I saw 2 bright yellowy eyes shining back at me, but just for a second or two. There was a dark area back there. Maybe it was covered in shadow, or maybe it was a cave, but there was a dark area I could see from where I was. In that dark area, for just a second or two, I saw eye shine from 2 eyes. Obviously it had to be an animal because I don't think humans have eye shine. I thought it might be an owl or a deer, and I wanted to find out. All of a sudden my archaeological dig seemed boring. I shoved my plastic shovel in my back pocket and started slowly, quietly, walking deeper into the woods to get a closer look at whatever gave off that eye shine. The further I walked into that bunch of tall trees, the darker everything got, and the larger everything seemed to get too. I came across an old rotting tree that was too large to climb over. Well, too large for me to climb over since I wasn't very good at climbing. It must have been 4.5 feet tall, or taller. I saw really big black ants in there, and I pretended in my head that the deeper I walked into those woods, the further back in time I was going. I didn't actually think that was happening. I was playing a kid's game in my head. My goal was still to find the source of that yellowy eye shine, but I was taking my time, trying to be as silent as possible, and trying to see and smell everything I could see and smell. There were a few trees that had crashed on top of each other, and it looked like it happened a long time ago. Underneath the fallen giants, a bit of a tree cave had been created, and it looked pitch black under there from where I was standing. I wondered if that might have been the very dark place I saw the eyes peering out from. I walked closer to the tree cave, excitedly at first, but increasingly slowly as I got a better look at it. Even up close, it looked extremely dark in there. I walked up and down by the entrance and squinted into the darkness. I took a step in, and it was easier to see, so I took a second step, and a third. Soon, I could make out that the reason these trees had all fallen over each other on this spot was that the ground had receded and fallen away. There was a path clearly leading down into the earth itself. A cavern had opened up, like a sinkhole large enough to walk down into. As fascinated as I was by all this, that was more of an adventure that I wanted to get involved in before dinner time. I decided to leave, but instead, I just kept standing on that spot, staring down into the tunnel that seemed to lead down into the center of the earth itself. My eyes were attracted to something moving in the darkness. I thought at first it was something alive. Then, I realized it was a kind of a mist that was coming out of the tunnel. Did that mean it was hot down there? Or did that mean it was cold down there? Maybe it was a disco and they were running a dry ice fog machine, I don't know. But you could faintly see a slow, moving mist coming up out of the tunnel in the ground. I thought for a minute about going and getting my father and bringing him back here. Maybe he would go inside with me? Nah, he wouldn't. The chances of him even coming back to this spot with me were next to zero. Maybe I could get a park ranger to come in with me then. The park rangers must already know about this. It doesn't look like it all fell in yesterday. That made me wonder, why wasn't the entrance blocked off if the park rangers knew about this hole in the ground? And if it had clearly been there for years, and if they hadn't roped it off, did that mean it was okay for me to walk down into it? Maybe it did. Is the absence of a keep out sign the same as a welcome mat? I was a kid, I wasn't really sure. Maybe I sort of had implicit permission to walk down into that cave system or a sinkhole or whatever it actually was. Rather than leaving, I took one more cautious step toward the hole to try to see deeper down into it. The change of my vantage point allowed me to see part of the tunnel which had been previously blocked from my view. There was something in that darkness. It was such darkness that I couldn't see anything by looking directly into it. Yet, each time I looked away, I saw that shadow with my peripheral vision. Then I was certain I was sensing something moving in there. I kept doing that, looking at the shadow, looking away, looking back. I continued to be certain something was in there when I viewed it peripherally, but I would not see anything once my eyes looked back directly at it. Until I looked at that shadow, and I swear to you, that eye shine turned and looked right back at me. It was the same yellowy eye shine from before, and I saw it there in front of me in that cave. What kind of animals hide in caves, I wondered. Bats? As I looked directly at those eyes, they began moving. No, rushing directly toward my position. There were animal sounds coming from that direction, and they were not bat-like. This was not a squeaking animal. This was a growling, snarling animal. It sounded like a big dog, and every angry noise it made as it charged me echoed in that cave tunnel it was running out of. It created a feeling of the end of the world, swelling up out of the earth and getting ready to swallow me into itself. I ran. I ran out of the woods into the sunlight, expecting to feel safe once I got there. I could hear the sounds of a monster dog barking at me and whining at the same time. It was in the woods still, but it was on my trail. I hadn't seen it, but I already knew it was a big and horrible thing just from the sound of it, and I was crying. I saw in my mind every time my family had ever done anything nice for me, and I felt badly that I would never see them again. I ran, and I tried to save myself, but at the same time, I was gripped by the irony that I would miss my family, who I had never had anything nice to say about. Even they were preferable to this situation. When they tore me apart, it was only emotionally. I was in a pretty bad state, but I had not even seen what was following me yet. Sure, I had seen the eyes in the darkness, but I had no idea what kind of head those eyes were in. I knew it wasn't Bambi chasing me, because Bambi didn't growl and snarl. Could it be a dog with rabies? I wondered how much physical danger I was actually in. Finally, behind me, I heard the sound of whatever it was crashing out of the woods into the clearing I had been running in. I needed to stop and catch my breath, so I looked behind me to learn who my new friend was. What I saw pretty much sent me over the edge. Now I'll describe to you what I saw, but you should know first that it took almost 10 years of therapy before I was able to tell anyone what I saw. I certainly couldn't tell my parents what it was that day. I couldn't say anything coherent to them at all. At first, they yelled at me to stop acting crazy. Then they slowly came to understand that this was out of my control. Something had driven me mad and made me incoherent. They took me to our family doctor, who said I was dehydrated, but otherwise normal physically. We then drove to see his colleague, that other kind of doctor that you go to after you've been chased by Dogman and you've been driven out of your mind. I was in a really bad state for over a week, but I went back to mostly normal really fast after that. I blanked out the monster experience, then I went back to normal. I'm not sure if my shrink blocked it out for me, using hypnosis or something, or if my brain did it for me itself, but blocking out that memory allowed me to be a normal kid again. Then, bit by bit, over the years, Dr. Shrinkenstein restored my memories of that horrible day. So here's what happened before we were so rudely interrupted by my loss of sanity. Panting for air, I looked behind me, and there it was, anger personified. It was ridiculous looking, and it was overdone. That was my first impression. It was as though whoever designs living beings decided to make a Halloween special model. A living being designed to look as frightening as something could look. Like this thing's superpower was ugliness and scariness. Even though it was large and muscular and strong and seemed in good health, something about the way the animal moved was incorrect. And I can't even explain what that means. The way it moved was revolting to me. It disgusted me. I wish I were gifted enough to describe what I saw, but my mind reeled back in horror at every part of it. Basically, we're talking about a really ugly dog here. It was tall and wide, and it looked like it could beat up an aircraft carrier, but it also looked somehow unfortunate and sickly. Yeah, muscular, healthy, and sickly all at once. This is why I felt so nauseous viewing it. It didn't feel like something that I was meant to see. When people talk about other realities coexisting with ours, my ears perk up, because That is kind of what I was thinking was going on with this hairy dog-faced gentleman. I say dog-faced instead of dog-headed because that's what I saw. I saw a dog face on a mainly primate body. But again, it was an incorrect primate body that somehow functioned anyway. It wasn't deformed by birth defects. This thing was supposed to look like the way it looked. But it's just that nothing could possibly look like it did. And that was more terrifying to me than the idea of it eating me for lunch. There's probably the key central part of why I lost it so badly when this happened. I was literally more afraid of the implications of this thing's existence than I was even about the idea of my life ending. Kids already sense enough about the way the world works to know that if monsters that can't exist begin to exist, it could make things much worse for reality itself. I don't remember if I believed in life after death at that age, but I would think that if we do survive in some way, even that survival itself would be placed in jeopardy once that, which can't exist, comes to life. I wasn't a kid who was in therapy because of family trouble or abuse or anything like that. I was a kid who was in therapy because of pure, deep, existential dread of a Lovecraftian nature. So, what saved me from the impossible monster on that day? What allowed me to live long enough to tell you this tale? My sister was sent by my parents to retrieve me so we could eat. She wandered toward where I was, and the Dogman, hearing her approach, ran away before she could see him. She dragged me back to eat, but I was in outer space by that point, nearly catatonic. I don't really remember any of that. I just know what they told me about it. I stared forward, looking stunned, with my mouth hanging open until I began to drool and gross them out. And the most horrible part of all is that it was my stupid sister who saved my life. She doesn't even wish me happy birthday on social media. What kind of a universe has someone who doesn't care if I live or die save my life? I don't want to feel grateful to her. Who am I, Gandhi? What am I supposed to love everybody that hates me? What's that all about? But I am grateful to my parents who paid for a decade of therapy, which allowed me to tell you this story today. Sometimes I can't believe it really happened, but that's the story of the time that Dogman almost drove me crazy. The Black-Eyed Kids and Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've had a pretty normal, boring life, and I'm proud of that. I have a wife and a kid and a job at a company, and everything is incredibly normal by plan and design. It takes a lot of work to have a boring life, believe me. But I had one day that was so incredibly scary and weird and out of the ordinary that it deserves to be in some kind of Guinness Book of the Weirdest Days of All Time or something. If I were you, I'd be sitting, or better yet, lying down, when you hear this story, and don't listen to it while operating heavy machinery. I get scared each time I retell it, so I just want to write it down for you, then try to forget it ever happened. If I ever felt something like this was going to happen to me again, I don't know what I'd do. Probably just lose my mind. My greatest fear is encountering any of the three figures in this story ever again. Okay, this happened around 2009-ish. I didn't have GPS in my car. I had paper maps in the glove compartment, all folded back the wrong way. I was trying to drive home using a shortcut I had never used before, and I got lost along a dark old country highway. It was cut out of the woods and had a grass partition in the middle, with 2 lanes of traffic going in opposite directions on either side. There was nothing but the highway and the forest, as far as you could see in any direction. I pulled off onto the grass on the right and pulled out one of the maps, studying it intently and trying to imagine where I made the wrong turn. Suddenly, there was a tapping on the driver's seat window to my left, and I leaped in the air and out of my skin. I think I made a sound like a comedy character would make in an old movie when that tapping happened. I instantly was completely gripped by fear. I was in the middle of nowhere, lost, and there was no other traffic anywhere. Plus, at night, any intrusion from outside naturally takes on an ominous feel. I looked to my left, and I saw 2 kids in dark hoodies, with the hoodies pulled all the way up, so I could really only see their noses and mouths. I looked around quickly to see if a car had pulled up behind me while I was preoccupied, but there was still nothing to be seen in any direction but the highway and the trees, and of course the stars above us. These kids couldn't possibly be there. I didn't say anything. I didn't roll down my window. I just looked at them. The taller kid, expressionless, tapped on my window again. I didn't like any part of this, and I had half a mind to peel out of there, but I knew I would have felt dumb afterward if I got scared of 2 kids. I rolled down my window just enough that I could hear them speak and ask them what they wanted. "You need to give us a lift home, mister," said the taller one. "You need to ask us into your motor vehicle, then we can get in with you." I asked them to give me their parents' phone number and offered to call them on my cell phone so that they could come pick up the 2 boys. The boys stood there, blankly, unresponsive. I started to repeat the offer and the older one interrupted me, telling me that their mother was waiting for them and I needed to let them in so I could drive them home to their mother. I stared back at the 2 boys, not really knowing what to say. The younger one said, "We can't get in until you say it's okay, mister," and I looked at him more closely than I had before. There was something really strange about that kid. The older one waved his hand in front of the smaller one's face, as though to distract me from looking too closely. Then, he repeated his opening monologue in a far more threatening-sounding manner than he had during his first run-through. It was as though they had limited scripts available to them, as they kept repeating variations on the same theme over and over again, but in a nastier way each time. Eventually, the taller kid grew impatient and leaned forward, trying to look in my back seat for some reason. As he did so, his face was lit by the interior car light, and for the first time, I saw very clearly that this kid did not have any whites in his eyes. People ask me if I mean he looked like an alien, and I have to admit I don't know what an alien looks like. What I would compare it to is the eye of a deer in the headlights, just black and dilated as wide as possible. If there were whites in those eyes, they barely existed around the edges. I shouted in horror, just as though they were the adults and I was the kid. I didn't like the way it felt like they were in control of the situation, so I just took the car out of neutral and I floored it out of there. I looked in my rear view mirror but didn't see them. I guess they ran back in the woods where they had been hiding. But if they were scammers of some sort, how had they known to hide right near where I would stop? If they had been real kids in trouble, they would have given me a phone number to call, so I know they had to have been up to no good of some sort or another. I know they could not have been telling the truth. So, what exactly had happened? And where exactly was I heading? I hadn't had time to study the map long enough to solve that situation, and I no longer had the nerve to pull over along this particularly weird stretch of highway. I decided I would just have to drive until I found something open where I could ask directions, or at least stay in a well-lit area while I read my map. I was lost in Vineland or near it, which is a part of New Jersey that's extra creepy at night. Better to drive it during the day first and learn it, which is the opposite of what I was doing. It felt like I was driving for a half hour and hadn't seen any buildings. I might be exaggerating, because this happened years ago, but it sure felt like I was trapped in an unending nightmare. So, of course, right as I thought that I was trapped in a nightmare, this very tall, hairy man ran out from behind a tree like he had been waiting for me all night. It was like the director yelled, "Action!" and this guy ran out for my car. I screamed and swerved the car, and I barely avoided hitting the guy, but at one point, my headlights were shining directly on him, and he was the freak show of the year. He either was hairy all over, or he was wearing animal skins because I saw no clothing. He either had a dog or wolf-like head, or he was wearing a wolf head as a mask or helmet or something. It all happened so fast, I can't be perfectly sure. In my gut, I'll be honest, I think what I saw was a Dogman. That having been said, I was in a high-stress state and was still terrified by what had happened with those two kids back there. So, I was on edge before the man or creature entered the picture. That might have a lot to do with what I saw, or what I thought I was seeing. Maybe it was a daredevil weirdo in a costume. Maybe it wasn't an actual Dogman, whatever a Dogman actually is. However, if that was a guy in a suit, he was a complete nut job. He might have given himself a bad boo-boo the way he ran out in front of my car. And then, after I managed to save his life by swerving around him, he thanked me by grabbing my back fender and trying to stop my car from getting away. He actually tried to physically stop a moving vehicle with his hands. I mean, he must have had hands, because it felt like he grabbed the back fender. I had to pound the gas pedal to get away from him, but he pulled out a corner of the bumper in the process. I drove away and saw the man drop to all fours and run after me as though he were some kind of wild dog. I wonder if I witnessed a shaman that night, or if it was just some meth head tweaking, or obviously, maybe it really was a Dogman, or werewolf, or something of that nature. The thing is, you can't tell me that the first incident had nothing to do with the second one. Those black-eyed kids had something to do with that Dogman. Maybe both events were hallucinations. Maybe there was a gas leak in the area. On the other hand, if that's the case, then what exactly happened to my back fender? There had to be some real element to what happened. Maybe I was imagining or confused about what I was seeing. But something had to have actually been there outside of me and outside of my nervous system that pulled out my bumper like that. And I think something was physically there next to my car when I saw those two kids as well. I think there was something living and conscious with very bad intentions for me standing right there, telling me I should invite it into my car and my life. Maybe that consciousness was the exact same thing that I saw the second time as the Dogman? All I know is, after that, my life went back to being really boring and very normal. I knock on wood as I say that, hoping it keeps on keeping on in the boring fashion. I really honestly truly never again want to experience anything in any way like what I went through in New Jersey on the night that I encountered the black-eyed kids and Dogman. The Dogman from the Dog Star. Dear Scary Stories NYC, you'll probably think my story is crazy, and even though it happened to me, I would have to agree with you. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen, or at least that it didn't seem very real to me at the time. This is a story of a time that we lived in horror and fear because of the Dog Star Dogman. My wife and I were married young, but she had a rich father who gave me a job and found us an affordable home. So we were like a middle-aged couple, even in our early 20s. Not many 22-year-olds are concerned with mowing the lawn and paying off a mortgage, but that was how I spent my young adulthood. This was the early 1970s, and my wife didn't work at the time. She does now, part-time, which I find absurd because I enjoy retirement. We're having a pretty good old age so far, but this is not a story about old age. This is a story about the time when our whole world went completely insane. I was driving myself and my wife, let's call her Enid, home from a business-related party we had attended. It was dark out, and we were both a bit tired. I couldn't wait to get home and go to sleep. Little did I know, we wouldn't be getting home till almost dawn. Enid saw a light in the sky. I didn't think much of it. So what? A light in the sky, big deal, right? But she kept going on about it and gasping about how beautiful it was. I was so tired I just didn't care. Then, the highway we were on took a right turn, and now I was driving in the direction that Enid's window had been facing for the past few minutes. Now I was looking directly at what she had been seeing, and it really blew my mind, as they used to say back in those days. This was not one light. This was a whole bunch of lights. Now, looking back on it, I guess I would compare it with the alien spacecraft in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but that hadn't been made yet when we saw this. It looked like we were viewing the underside of an immense craft, but it was far off in the distance. It was very hard to describe because the thing was irregularly shaped. I guess it was essentially flat on the bottom, but there were all sorts of ridges and grooves and multiple layers of surfaces under there. Also, there were all manner of lights, all different shapes and all different colors, as though we were seeing a city lit up at night, hanging upside down in the sky, off in the distance. It was truly unfathomable, and both Enid and I could do nothing but gasp in awe. I immediately felt a deep sense of fear as we saw a whole lot of little tiny red lights emerge from behind the top of the craft. They went up in the air, then created a formation and headed quickly down in our direction. That was the most paranoid feeling moment of my life. The idea that I saw a vast city-sized aircraft off in the distance, and that city-sized aircraft then dispatched a slew of smaller red flying vehicles or drones directly toward me. That was something that I literally would not have been able to even imagine before it actually happened. It was a very why me moment for me. The next thing I remember, I was driving along and Enid said, "Well, that's a relief." I wondered what was a relief. I felt like I had forgotten something. Enid said it was a relief that the little red spacecraft were gone. Slowly, the images emerged in my memory again. I thought it was strange that I didn't remember them going away. I remember the big craft, I remember the little crafts approaching, and now I'm driving. That was my reality. I chalked it up to being so tired. As we pulled onto our street that night, I noticed the sky seemed to be getting lighter in the east. I asked Enid if she thought there had been a plane crash or an explosion in that direction. She asked why I was asking. I said it was because the sky was lighting up from there. In stunned shock, we both saw the time simultaneously. That was the light from an explosion, all right, but it's the ongoing explosion we call the sun. It was coming up. It was dawn. We had somehow been driving all night. We had been expecting to get home before midnight, so this was more than a small surprise. Fortunately for me, it was a Saturday, so I didn't have to go to work without sleep, but that was one wasted weekend. We tried to get things done around the house, but mainly we slept and argued with each other crankily. Don't witness a UFO unless you want to lose a lot of sleep, take it from me. Sometime during that week, Enid called me at my job to complain to me that we had some kind of weird bear dog on our property and that I should call animal control. I told her that if I called animal control to report a monster, I wouldn't get a very positive response. Still, I was concerned for her safety, and I didn't want her stressing out or feeling in danger, so I knew I would have to do something about it. When I got home that night, I asked Enid to explain to me exactly what happened. She was still clearly shaken up and shook a bit as she spoke to me. Taking me to the large windows in our TV room, she pointed out to the line of trees in the back of the yard. She told me that he was standing there, moving back and forth behind those trees, and that he was staring at her as though he had nothing better to do all afternoon. She felt at the time that the animal was going to break into the house and get at her. She thought that an animal wouldn't invest that much time studying her unless it had some kind of plan in its mind to do something with all this information it was gathering. That kind of made me chuckle that she was ascribing these human qualities to a dumb animal. I asked her to describe its appearance for me, and she got a pencil and some paper. She sketched a drawing while telling me about it. I was expecting to see a drawing of the bear dog that looked like either a bear or a dog, but she drew something that made no sense to me at all. It looked like a hairy man more than it looked like a dog. I thought maybe someone had played a trick on her. You know, this looks like someone in a Halloween costume, I suggested to her cautiously, observing her reaction. Exactly, she cried out, but it's too tall to be a man. It was 8 feet tall if it was an inch. I wanted to laugh, but I shivered instead. She was getting me to believe her, but her story was absurd. There are no 8-foot-tall bipedal dog bears. They just don't exist. If it lives in the forest and it has fur, then it runs on all 4 legs. We don't have primates in the North American forests, and we don't have bipedal dog bears either. I took her to the back door and asked her to walk me out into the yard and show me exactly where the creature stood. This way we could look and see if there was any evidence there. I was hoping we could find evidence proving that it was a prank to calm my wife down, but I wasn't sure exactly what I should be looking for. Enid froze up at the idea of walking toward the forest where that thing had been. She really didn't want to do it. Her fear was clearly genuine. I talked to her calmly and told her it was hours later and that thing was long gone. I reminded her I'd walk with her, and finally she agreed to show me where it had been. We took maybe 5 or 6 steps toward those trees, and we both stopped short as we heard this sound that could only be a deep growling. It was angry sounding, and it shook the ground underneath our feet. It rocked our world to the points that we both ran inside, shivering all over. I was shaking so much that it was hard to run, and it was hard to lock the door once we got inside. We shook as though all the blood had been drained from our bodies, and we were out in the cold Antarctic. If I felt that much fear just from hearing the creature, I could only imagine what my wife must have felt while actually seeing the thing. We held each other and let our emotions out. It was not a very happy moment, but we got through it together. The next morning over breakfast, Enid told me that the monster was related to the UFO experience we had. I almost choked on my coffee. UFO experience? When did we have a UFO experience? Was that like the Jimi Hendrix experience? I got all sarcastic. Enid reminded me of the large craft that emitted the smaller red crafts, and the way we couldn't remember what happened for hours after that. I grew annoyed at her that she was trying to turn lights in the sky into us meeting spacemen or something. I was getting ready for work. I didn't want to hear her fairy stories. All day at work, I felt guilty for having been short with her in the morning. She didn't call me once, and I was afraid to call her. I just hoped that the animal stalker thing had moved on and that we could soon forget about all of this. I bought her roses on the way home and prepared myself mentally for apologizing and focusing on her needs for that evening. As I got home, pulling into the driveway, as if on cue, my wife came running from the backyard, screaming and racing up the driveway. I parked the car, then got out to see what the trouble was, but before I could even get my car door closed behind me, I saw what Enid was running from. It was the dog bear. It had to be, although to me it looked more like a werewolf from the comic books than anything else. It was the size of a very tall man. Maybe it really was too tall to even be a man, as my wife had suggested the night earlier. It was shaggy all over. Not just furry, but shaggy. It was the hairiest animal I'd ever seen. It had these very long fangs and the face of a crazy dog. Like a dog that's completely out of its mind, you know? I guess it had a dog nose. It must have, for me and Enid to have both seen it as being some kind of dog. I remember the ears were on top and not on the sides, so it did look like a canine. Its eyes practically glowed in the shadow of where it was standing. That creature and I just looked at each other. It stopped chasing my wife to stare at me, basically. That was essentially what was going on. I don't know what I would have done if it charged me. Maybe I would have tried to get back in the car and lock it. I didn't have to decide, though, because the Dogman just calmly turned and walked off, just like that, gone into the backyard and out of view. I walked on very unsteady legs back to the front door and went inside to find my wife with her face in her hands, weeping. She asked me if I believed her now that the creature was somehow related to that UFO we had seen, and I just held her and agreed with whatever she said. I remembered that I had left the roses in the car, but they seemed more than trite at a time like that. I've even got a name for that stupid thing, she said through tears. I call him the Dog Star, because I think that's where he's from. I'm not sure I had any argument for her any longer on that subject. I mean, I'm not saying I agreed with her that this dog-like bear thing was from outer space, but it shouldn't exist at all, so it's not like she was crazy for taking a guess as to its origin, as much as I tried to brush off the lights in the sky. It was weird how late we got home that night. Since I couldn't explain those lights, the missing time, or the crazy animal man that seemed obsessed with Enid, maybe she was right, and the three things were actually part of one thing. I wanted to do something to make this right, something to get Enid away from that horrible tall dog. I asked her if we should move, then immediately apologized, thinking that was a dumb idea. I mean, if the Dog Star, as she called him, was really from outer space, it would have no trouble at all following us to a new home. I apologized for the stupid idea, but Enid told me that it might be a great idea. What she was thinking was that we should move to an apartment somewhere closer to my work. We didn't have any children yet. We really didn't need all that space or that mortgage. It might make more sense to rent for a few years, and it might make it harder for the dog bear to stalk her if he had to use the elevator to do it. Happy to have a plan in place, I told my lovely wife to pack for a few days. I told her I would find us a hotel room and take her out to dinner. In the car, she found the roses, and that was the best time for her to do so. She stayed in hotels and with friends until I got us the new apartment. I never let her go back to the house again, and she didn't argue very much about that. I took care of the house until it was sold, and I never saw that Dogman once the entire time. I guess it was more interested in Enid than it was in me anyway. We ended up having a family, but we raised them as city kids. Enid never really wanted to go back to the suburbs after the experiences we had. They say these days that if you've had one UFO experience, then you've had a lot of them, and you're still having them. If that's true with my wife and myself, I'm glad that we don't remember any of it. To us, it feels like when we moved to the city, the phenomenon decided to stay in the country. Maybe we're fooling ourselves, but as far as we know, nothing strange has ever happened to us again after the Dogman from the Dog Star. Devil Dog appeared in our yard. Dear Scary Stories NYC. This story happened around 4 or 5 years ago when I was home visiting my family for the holidays. It had to have happened in 2014 or 2015 for reasons I'll explain later on. It has to do with a sighting of a kind of a dogman famous in England and known as Black Shuck. Now, my family is not British. In fact, we are still to this day based in Indiana, but we all knew the story of Black Shuck because my mother used to read us monster stories before we went to bed at night. I remember she would read from old, yellowed paperback books from the 20th century. I forget the titles and authors, but I'm guessing maybe Frank Edwards and John Keel. Some of them were written for children, and those were never as good as the ones written for general audiences. Although the drawback of Mom reading the books written for adults was, every time she came upon a word we didn't know, she would put the bookmark in the book, then put the book down, then she would stand up, walk across the bedroom to the bookshelf, bend over and find the dictionary, pull it out, walk back to her seat, look up the word and read the definition to us. She would make us use the word in 2 sentences correctly before she would smile, stand up, walk the book back to the bookcase, then return and find her place in the monster story. One day, I moved the dictionary over to my bed table before she started reading. She told me she was proud of me for using the dictionary on my own, but actually, I just wanted to cut down the time it took for her to look up words during the bedtime monster stories. One of my brother and my favorite stories that we ever heard was the story of Black Shuck. We both thought that Black Shuck was in actuality a dogman. If you don't know the story, it has been reported in British history as fact that on the date of August 4th, in the year 1577, church was being held during a thunderstorm. A clap of lightning and thunder heralded the doors bursting open, and the largest black dog anyone had ever seen burst in. Its eyes were said to glow red as it made short work of ending the lives and dreams of churchgoers. Although Shuck was said to move with lightning quickness and could claim victims easily, he didn't even need to touch a person to spell their doom. Just to look upon the monster was said to be enough to claim your life itself. After attacking Holy Trinity Church in Blythburgh, it left and attacked parishioners at St. Mary's Church in Bungay, which is over 10 miles away. Both my brother and I were and are fascinated by Dogman, so this story stuck out in our minds as a possible medieval sighting of him. Maybe he moved too quickly in both events for people to notice him standing on his hind legs, or maybe his horrific actions seemed more important for the people of the time to report than his bipedal motion. On the other hand, maybe he just never exhibited this behavior in front of the surviving witnesses. After all, there are a number of Dogman sightings in which the creature remains on all fours like a normal dog, but is too large and too intelligent or evil-seeming to just be a regular pooch. So, the way I know this story took place in 2014 or 2015 is because it was back around then that someone found remains of a dog that would have been 7 feet long in life, buried in a shallow grave in a churchyard just a few miles from where the story of the legendary Black Shuck took place. My brother brought this up, and neither I nor my parents had heard of this before. We checked the internet and were amazed to find that it was true. The article we read made the odd comment that the dog would have been 7 foot tall if it stood on its hind legs. I'm not sure why they even said that, unless maybe they were thinking the same thing that my brother and I had thought since we were kids, that possibly this Black Shuck was actually some kind of a dogman or werewolf when it was alive. This truly was a remarkable and surreal experience. After all those years, to be back in the home I had first heard the Black Shuck legend in, looking at images of what might have been the remains of the actual beast itself. A memorable experience for me and my family, but not enough to write a story for you about. So, why am I writing you then? Well, the next night, as we were all getting ready to hit the hay, my brother screamed from his bedroom, and the 3 of us all ran in to see what had happened. He was fine, but he was staring out of the back window at the yard outside in the darkness. When we got a good look at what he was seeing, we all felt like we had gone insane. My mother gasped. My father shouted, "No way!" And I probably said stuff I can't repeat as we all looked out that window. And I'll be darned if we didn't see the largest dog any of us had ever seen. It had to be 4 or 5 feet tall at the shoulder, and I swear it had bright red eye shine coming from those eyes. It was not looking up at us. It was staring toward our driveway. Maybe it had pursued some other animal here, and that's where it thought the animal had gone. It just stood at attention, motionless. It was not panting. Its tail remained perfectly still and pointed downward. After a period of just staring in dumb, shocked astonishment, my father came to his senses first and started barking out orders. He told us to keep the lights out in the bedroom to prevent glare and reflection on the windows, and we should get our cell phone cameras ready. Then he ran downstairs to turn the backyard lights on so we could all get a nice, well-lit, and in-focus photo of something that couldn't possibly exist. Well, we got our cameras, and we got it as dark as we could in that room. Dad did his part, turning on the backyard nighttime floodlights from the switch in the basement. But as soon as those lights flashed on, I couldn't see where the Dogman went. I admit, I was blinded momentarily as the lights flashed on, but it wasn't as though those lights were in our faces. They were below and pointed forward toward the yard and the now missing Black Shuck dog. The three of us made sounds like you would hear at a Penn and Teller show, like ooh and ah. We had no idea how that trick had been done, or even who had performed it for us, but that was one heck of a trick, all right. This event really opened my mind to the strange nature of our universe, and that the only thing we can really be sure of in life is that we can't be sure of anything. It can be terrifying to think about, but I choose to be amazed and to wonder about everything. I even wonder about big, scary, predatory, mythical creatures that could end you just by looking at you. And that's because a devil dog appeared in my yard. Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it with your friends and family that you think might also be interested. If you would like to see more of our work, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon next to the subscribe button so that YouTube will alert you when we put out a new video. To become a channel member and gain access to our special perks, you can click that join link under each of our videos. Another option is to join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. You can join for as little as 99 cents on YouTube or $1.50 at peterbernard.com, and that gains you access to our weekly secret uncensored episodes. If you'd like to see our 21 hours of archives of uncensored Dogman stories, then please join at the $3 level or above. To get to watch our shows in advance of the public, please join at our $10 level. That gets you all the perks. If you join our channel memberships, you need to check our community page here on YouTube in order to get the links to the secret videos and other perks. If you're in the PayPal subscribers club, Peter will email you all the news and links himself. Once joining the PayPal club, which is Peter's homemade club, please give him a chance to see that you've joined and to compose you a personal welcome email, as none of that is automated. But whichever you join, we'll name you an executive producer for the next available episode. Do you have a scary experience that you'd like to share with us? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LA-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. It's a Google voicemail box, so that means it keeps cutting off after every 3 minutes. If your story is longer than that, please keep calling back and we can piece it together on our end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.